If you'll turn in your Bibles to 1 Samuel chapter 20 and 21, in this video we're going to read these two chapters and look at one of the saddest stories in all of the Old Testament. We'll look at four different incidences in David's life, and then we'll draw some application at the end. So let's begin in chapter 21. And the first is that David visits the priest Ahimelech. David went to the town of Nob to see Ahimelech the priest. Ahimelech trembled when he saw him. "Why are you alone?" he asked. "Why is no one with you?" Now Ahimelech is in the high priest, and he's in Nob because the priest had been moved there. And he consults David a lot, so it's not unusual for him to see David, but David is usually there with the king's army, or with the blessing of the king, or with another errand from the king, but he never shows up alone, without a weapon, without food. And so Ahimelech is scared because he realizes that Saul is vicious, and he's after David and will kill whoever stands in the way of him getting to David. So Ahimelech is rightfully so scared when he first sees David. "The king has sent me on a private matter," David said. "He told me not to tell anyone why I am here. I have told my men where to meet me later. Now, what is there to eat? Give me 5 loaves of bread or anything else you have." And so David tells a blatant lie here. He lets Ahimelech know, "Hey, I'm here on behalf of the king, but it's a private matter. I left so quickly I couldn't get a sword. I don't have any food. I need food." And so David is desperate and tells a ridiculous lie that obviously Ahimelech doesn't buy into. "We don't have any regular bread," the priest replied, "but there is the holy bread, which you can have if your young men have not slept with any women recently." "Don't worry," David replied. "I never allow my men to be with women when they are on campaign, and since they stay clean on ordinary trips, how much more on this one?" Since there was no other food available, the priest gave him the holy bread, the bread of the presence that was placed before the Lord in the tabernacle. It had just been replaced that day with fresh bread. Now, when they erected the tabernacle, they would always, every week on the Sabbath day, replace the bread, and that bread would sit there, and it represented to the people of Israel the manna that God gave them in the wilderness, so that they would remember that God always supplied their needs for the people of Israel. And that's all the food that was there, and of course, only the priests were allowed to eat that bread. They were not allowed to give it away, but Ahimelech says, "You know what, I'll give it to you if your men have not been ceremonially unclean," and David assures them that he hasn't. So the priest here really breaks the law to give David the bread because David is in a desperate situation. He should only have given the bread to priest to eat, and so, but it's the Sabbath day, and he's replacing it, so he gives that to David. Now Dog the Edomite, Saul's chief herdsman, was there that day, having been detained before the Lord. David asked Ahimelech, "Do you have a spear or sword? The king's business was so urgent that I didn't even have time to grab a weapon." "I only have the sword of Goliath the Philistine, whom you killed in the valley of Elah," the priest replied. "It is wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. Take that if you want it, for there is nothing else here." "There is nothing like it," David replied. "Give it to me." So Dog the Edomite was high up in the court of Saul. He was his chief herdsman, handled all of his herds. And he is a proselyte to the Jewish religion. So by birth, he is a Gentile from Edom. He's a Palestinian. And so he has now come under the auspices of the kingdom, and Saul is his boss, and so he's a proselyte to the Jewish religion. And he's detained before the Lord here because there's some sort of proselyte vow that he has to keep, or some sort of purification rite he has to keep as a proselyte. And so he is there on that day for that purpose and sees everything that happens. And of course, what the priest does, Ahimelech, is he gives David not only the bread, but he also gives him Goliath's sword that was kept there as a representation of the famous story of when David killed Goliath. And so that's story number one. I want you to kind of put that to the side, and let's look here now at story number 2. Verse 10, "So David escaped from Saul and went to King Achish of Gath. But the officers of Achish were unhappy about his being there. 'Isn't this David the king of the land?' they asked. 'Isn't he the one the people honor with dances, singing, Saul has killed his thousands and David his 10,000?' David heard these comments and was very afraid of the king Achish of Gath might do to him. So he pretended to be insane, scratching on doors and drooling down his beard. Finally, King Achish said to the men, "Must you bring me a madman? We already have enough of them around here. Why should I let someone like this be my guest?" And so in this second story, a couple of things are interesting. Gath is where Goliath is from. So Achish is the Philistine king. And so David has literally taken Goliath's sword and ended up in Gath, the home of the Philistines, and the hometown, the home area of Goliath. It's like being on a road in Southern California, and you get off at an exit and realize you're in Compton with a car that belongs to them. I mean, it's just a bad situation all the way around. And immediately, King Achish's men are angry and upset with David being there, especially with Goliath's sword, and David immediately recognizes he's in danger. And so what he does is he pretends to be crazy. He acts like he is mentally unstable. Now, here's the reason. If you'll remember, in those days, the pagans had many, many gods, and they believed people who were crazy, people who were insane, had been inhabited by one of the gods, and it was a spiritual encounter. And so they never killed their crazy people or insane people. They'd never kill them because they believed that it was a spiritual matter, that they were insane, and they would not touch someone who had a God within them, even if he was doing something bad, because they didn't want that God to then come take revenge on them. So David knew he's going to die. He also knew that if he acted insane, they wouldn't kill him because they knew that he was housing a god of some sort that might hurt them if they killed him. So they just ran him away. They just ran him off. And so that helps you understand a little bit about that story. So now, chapter 22. So David left Gath and escaped to the cave of Adullam. Soon his brothers and all of his other relatives joined him there. Then others began coming, men who were in trouble or in debt or who were just discontented, until David was the captain of about 400 men. So David is a fugitive in the land of Israel, and he is running around for his life, and Saul is trying to chase him down, but he's a leader. And so people who were discontented with Saul's leadership started coming over to David, and soon David is this fugitive, but he has an army of 400 men following him. Later, David went to Mizpah in Moab, where he asked the king, "Please allow my father and mother to live here with you until I know what God is going to do for me." So David's parents stayed in Moab with the king during the entire time David was living in his stronghold. One day, the prophet Gad told David, "Leave the stronghold and return to the land of Judah." So David went to the forest of Hereth. And so here, David is now protecting his parents. He takes them to Moab. Now, if you remember, David's great-grandmother is Ruth the Moabitess, which means his parents are the grandchildren of Ruth. And so he has Moabite blood, and his parents have more Moabite blood than he has. And so he's taking them back home to Moab, where they have a lineage, and he's asking the king, "Would you protect them for me, because I'm on the run, and Saul would like nothing more than to take people who I love and kill them." And so basically David is taking care of his parents. In the middle of running like a fugitive, he has the heart for his parents to stop and take them to a safe place and take care of them, which I think shows you part of the heart of David and why David was a man after God's own heart. So now we get really to the summation of the stories here. He says, "Listen here, you men of Benjamin," Saul shouted to his officers when he heard the news. "Has that son of Jesse promised every one of you fields and vineyards? Has he promised to make you all generals and captains in his army? Is that why you have conspired against me? For not one of you told me when my own son made a solemn pact with the son of Jesse. You're not even sorry for me. Think of it, my own son encouraging him to kill me, as he is trying to do this very day." Now, Saul is paranoid here. David's never tried to kill Saul, and his men have certainly not betrayed Saul and done anything to Saul with protecting David. This is all made up in Saul's mind because he's so paranoid because of his jealousy of David. Then Dog the Edomite, who was standing there with Saul's men, spoke up. "When I was at Nob," he said, "I saw the son of Jesse talking to the priest Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub. Ahimelech consulted the Lord for him. Then he gave him food and the sword of Goliath the Philistine." So Ahimelech consulted the Lord for David, on David's behalf, gave him food, and gave him the sword. So King Saul immediately sent for Ahimelech and all his family who served as priests at Nob. When they arrived, Saul shouted at him, "Listen to me, son of Ahitub." "What is it, my king?" Ahimelech asked. "Why have you and your son Jesse conspired against me?" Saul demanded. "Why did you give him food and a sword? Why have you consulted God for him? Why have you encouraged him to kill me as he is trying to do this very day? But sir, Ahimelech replied, is any one among all your servants as faithful as David, your son-in-law? Why, he is the captain of your bodyguard and a highly honored member of your household. This was certainly not the first time I had consulted God for him. May the king not accuse me and my family in this matter, for I knew nothing at all of any plot against you. So Ahimelech's telling the truth. He said, look, I just helped David as I've done tons of times before. David's not trying to hurt you. David hasn't tried to kill you. In fact, he's been very faithful. But Saul wouldn't hear it because of his jealousy and paranoia. For you will certainly die, Ahimelech, along with your entire family, the king shouted. And he ordered his bodyguards, kill these priests of the Lord, for they are allies and conspirators with David. They knew he was running away from me, but they didn't tell me. But Saul's men refused to kill the Lord's priest. Then the king said to Doeg, you do it. So Doeg the Edomite turned on them and killed them that day, 85 priests in all, still wearing their priestly garments. Then he went to Nob, the town of the priests, and killed the priests' families, men and women, children and babies, and all the cattle, donkeys, sheep, and goats. So the people, his leaders, wouldn't kill fellow Israelites. So he gets the Edomite, who doesn't have Jewish blood, to slaughter 85 priests and their families. He kills all the priests that day. Only Abiathar, one of sons of Ahimelech, escaped and fled to David. When he told David that Saul had killed the priests of the Lord, David exclaimed, I knew it. When I saw Doeg the Edomite there that day, I knew he was sure to tell Saul. Now I have caused the death of all your father's family. Stay here with me and don't be afraid. I will protect you with my own life, for the same person wants to kill us both. And of course, we know that Abiathar becomes David's high priest later when David becomes king. And so part of the story is how Abiathar became David's high priest. But the tragedy of this story is that Saul is so paranoid and so jealous and so upset about David that he's willing to kill anyone who stands in his way, including all the priests of Israel, 85 priests of Israel in the town of Nob. He slaughters them and their families and their kids and their baby, slaughters everyone, just because they helped David in a time of need. A tragic story, an awful story, one of the saddest stories in all the Old Testament. I do want to give you, though, a couple of lessons I think that we learn out of this that will help us. Number one is God has your back. God has your back. You need to know that relationship with God is about direction of your life and not perfection of your life. And when you enter into a covenant relationship with God, God has your back. He takes care of you. Are we going to sin? Absolutely. Did David sin? Absolutely. He lied to Abiathar the priest. He deceived King Achish in order to save his life. The result of his sin was devastating, and yet God didn't turn his back on David because David sinned, because he knew David's heart. David had he's a man after God's own heart. He has God's heart. He's taking care of his parents. He's going to take care of Abiathar. He takes care of these 400 men. He has a heart after God, and he is a leader after God, and he knows God has a plan for his life. And he's not perfect, but his heart is given over to God. And you need to hear this. Here's application of this story for you. You are never going to be perfect. You're never going to get it all right. But let me tell you something. If God has your heart, if you've turned your life over to Jesus Christ, you need to know in covenant relationship, God always has your back. He always has your back. And you need to know that, because that is part of what God promises in covenant relationship. And so, you know what? When you sin, be quick to repent. Be quick to confess that sin. And then you know what you need to do? You need to walk on. You need to move on. Because God's with you. He has you. You may have to suffer some consequences of that sin, but he has your back. He's going to protect you. He's not going to just turn you over because you make some mistakes, because you commit some sins. That's part of the relationship with God, is you're not going to be perfect. Which leads us to the second one, and that is sin has awful consequences. Sin has awful consequences. I mean, God didn't turn his back on David. God had David's back the whole time and set David up to be king later on. But it didn't stop the consequences of 85 priests and their families being murdered because of a choice David made. David chose to go see the priest. Doeg saw him. God brought it to light. When it came to light, Saul, in his meanness and jealousy and ungodliness, killed all those priests. What a cruel, awful man. but God still allowed the consequences of sin to take place. He'll protect your back, and he'll have you spiritually, and he'll forgive your sin, and he won't walk away from you relationship-wise. But he also won't protect you from consequences. He'll allow you to suffer the consequences because the pain of your consequences is the pain that where you learn your lessons of life so you'll be a better man or woman of God. That's where God does his work in you, is through the pain of your consequences. And so understand that this is such an important theological principle that when you're walking in covenant relationship with God and you sin, because you suffer the consequences, sometimes we equate that with God turning his back on us. God hasn't turned his back on us at all. He has our back. But those consequences are the teaching and the training to help us become better men, better women of God, better servants of God, because God is working and teaching us in the middle of the pain of our consequences. What he hasn't turned his back on, though, is he hasn't turned his back on our relationship. He still forgives us. He still loves us. He still protects us. He is still our God. We are still in covenant relationship with him, and when we die, we're still going to go to heaven. So don't mistake the consequences of your sin with God turning his back on you, because they are not the same thing. In fact, part of the consequences is because God loves you so much, he's not turning his back on you. So that's really, really important. The third application principle that is really important here is that God weaves his perfect will through the fabric of poor human choices. He weaves his perfect will through the fabric of poor human choices. Here's what God knows. God knows that he is going to make David king. He knows that Abiathar is going to be the high priest. He's going to weave his will through all of the fabric of poor human choices. David made a bad choice in this story. Saul made an awful choice in this story. And you could even make the case that Ahimelech made a bad choice in this story. Some bad choices. That's free will. That's human will. And God allows us to make those human choices. But here's the sovereignty of God at work. In all of our poor human choices, God's always weaving his will to make sure that his will gets done in the big picture of life. And so think about your relationship with God. You have freedom of choice all the time, but God is weaving his will through your choices, even your bad choices, to weave the thread of his will through you. So when you belong to God in covenant relationship, even when you make a 90-degree turn and really, really mess things up, God can still take his will and weave it through that and weave your story. Now, your story may end up different. The circumstances may end up different. It may not be everything God had for you, because sometimes your bad choices mean that you can't have everything God had for you, but it doesn't mean God's given up for you. He's still weaving his will through you. He's still weaving his will in you. He hasn't given up on you. And even your derailments, he's weaving those back into the story of your life and back into the story of his will of what he wants to accomplish in you. And so if you get derailed for a while, if you really, really make some bad choices and you see that you've really just messed things up for you or your kids or your wife or your husband or your family or your parents, whoever it is, your career, just know it's not over. It's not over. If you've lost your job, it's not over. If you've lost your career, it's not over. If you've lost your marriage, it's not over. What God will do is he'll weave his will through that, and he'll begin to reweave a new fabric of the story of your life through that. And you know what? Sometimes the end of that, the story ends up better than it ever was before, because God is what? He's the Redeemer. He redeems our life from the pit. He takes those bad choices and redeems those back into a wonderful story of grace and forgiveness and salvation. So understand that God's at work even in your bad choices. And then I would just also say that Jesus uses this story as an illustration about the law. It is in Matthew chapter 12, verses 1 through 8, where the Pharisees are upset with Jesus for picking grain on the Sabbath. And he tells them the story. He says, hey, listen, David was about to die of starvation. And so he and his men broke the law. They ate the bread because, you know what? It's more important for David to live and become king than it is to keep that law. And Jesus is teaching a very important illustration using this story out of 1 Samuel, this story to illustrate that there's the letter of the law and then there's the heart of the law. And the letter of the law is just what it is. It's just the law. But the heart of the law is always to honor God and love people. Honor God and love people. And if you start using the law to dishonor God and hurt people, then you're misusing and you're abusing the law. And that's what the Pharisees were doing. And God had to back them up and say, listen, I don't want you using my law that way. I don't want you using my law to hurt people. My law is to bless people. My law is to protect people. My law is to show love for people. And if you can't do that, then you're misusing my law. And that's a takeaway for you. I want you to think about that. As you follow the, quote, law of the Word, the promises of the Bible, and the laws in the Bible, they're all designed to honor God and protect people, to honor God and love people, to honor God and lift people up. Do not use the law of God to hurt people. Give grace, give mercy, give forgiveness. You don't overlook sin. You don't not speak truth, but it's all bathed in the heart of God, and that is a heart of mercy and compassion and love and grace. Tragic story, but in many ways the story of our lives. But God, He can even use tragedy. He can even use pain to weave His will for a wonderful future, and He will do that with you if you will let Him.